So, I actually spoke briefly to the founder of Architects and Engineers for 911 Truth, who has produced a movie, at least, actually more than one, but essentially one main movie, presenting testimony of various architectural and engineering experts regarding the great implausibility of the official story of the reasons why 3 buildings in New York collapsed in September of 2001, nearly 11 years ago. And this man and his organization tries to avoid the questions of speculation regarding who and why, and focus simply on the what and the how of what happened on that day nearly 11 years ago. What happened and how did it happen? Setting aside the questions of who did it and why did they do it as merely speculation that is based not so much on factual evidence, and he wants to try to confine his public presentations to what can be verified as factual information, to let people then go on the basis of what they see and think about regarding that factual information, then let people go on to do their own speculations on these other questions of who and why. Now, and this factual information is what he refers to as the smoking gun. And this is all true and all it's all true, it's all supportable, it's all a position that you can agree is a reasonable position to take, a reasonable stance to take, such that you can try to wake people up to the smoking gun situation, which reveals simply that we have been lied to in a monumental manner, and let people then go on to try to draw their own conclusions or try to do their own research into other questions such as motivations of who and why, and political involvements of all that. So his approach is simply to leave that to you, but just wake you up with this smoking gun. And I think that's all very valid. Because that was the word I was trying to think of when I was pausing for 20 seconds. Valid. It's a very valid approach. However, personally, I didn't believe the official story from the very day that it happened. Whether it was minutes or hours, it was probably more like within a few hours as I followed the developing story online. I quickly, certainly by the end of that day, had reached the conclusion that the whole thing was a monumental farce. And it wasn't, that was 2001. And it wasn't for another 6 years, or at least 5 years, that I even knew about the 3rd building. Okay, all I knew from the day that it happened for the next and for the following 5 or 6 years was what most people know, that the story was two airplanes slammed into the side of two tall skyscrapers, which proceeded to collapse directly straight down, not toppling over, doing actually minimal, the absolute minimal damage that you could imagine in that situation. It seemed to me, if the actual story had been what really happened, well, no, I guess I must have realized that explosives were involved. I just didn't get that specifically. I just didn't focus my mind specifically on that aspect of it. I just simply knew that it was a fake accounting of what had actually taken place. I didn't even specifically apply my mind to get into the details of the how. I didn't even get my mind to be thinking, as far as I can recall, 11 years later, to try to recall what my attitude was. I don't recall specifically thinking controlled demolition, okay? Those words, controlled demolition, didn't seem to enter my mind for another 5 or 6 years until I saw videos about it. Those words, controlled demolition, but it definitely seemed to me that those buildings being hit by airplanes could not have caused the reaction of those buildings, that they would fall straight down. And that was enough. I didn't have to delve my mind into thoughts about, well, how do explosives work, how are explosives planted, blah, 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 etc., etc. I didn't even have to get into that. And I guess I just didn't even really bother. I didn't bother to try to think specifically about exactly how it was done. I just knew that it didn't seem to make any sense that airplanes slamming from the side would result in a straight down. It seemed to me that if airplanes had actually slammed into those buildings, they would have probably damaged several blocks, at least, of Manhattan as the buildings fell over, got knocked over. And plus, I would have thought maybe like the top half of the building might have gotten knocked over, but most of the building below where the airplanes hit would have been, to some degree, remaining vertical, even if there were some dangerously leaning tower remains some kind of a very dangerous, precariously leaning tower, but still, at least at least at first, would remain more or less vertical until eventually probably toppling and destroying several city blocks, if not more, in the process. And I was just amazed at the actual minimalism of the damage that was done. I was amazed by when they were described as 50 to 100,000 people that worked in those two buildings. I was amazed at the minimalism of the number of people who actually died in those collapses. That it was only 3,000, when I was expecting to hear at the end of the day 40 to 50 or even 60,000 people had been estimated killed. And it was only 3,000. And as well, that the buildings collapsed straight down and didn't take out numerous other complete city blocks with them. That was amazing and highly, extremely suspicious. And of course, I think the thing that really convinced me by the end of that day was the immediate reaction of Bush. That was it, basically, the immediate reaction of Bush. So, and And I knew nothing. I had heard nothing of World Trade Center 7, the third building that went down that afternoon. I heard nothing of that for 5 or 6 years until I started seeing things on YouTube. So for 5 or 6 years from that very day, my immediate and initial reaction was that I did not believe the official story. That I believed from the very first day it happened that this was all a plot devised by Bush and his whole gang. Deliberately devised to scare the shit out of the American public and get us all fucking angry and ready to take dictation and do whatever the fuck our new Führer, Harold Bush, was going to direct us to do. And when he began immediately directing us to creating a war, did not surprise me in the least fucking bit. And when that war happened to end up being Iraq, considering that a mere 10 years before, his own daddy had done a war against Iraq, and all this calling of assassination of Saddam Hussein didn't surprise me at all, because it was deja vu all over again. It was exactly what I actually expected during the campaign. When Bush Jr. was running, and or was it just after he became declared, after the election, the so-called election? I remember online in the chat room there was this Irish English woman, and she was I think in her early 30s, an English woman of Irish origins, and she was saying, I'm scared for my 3 young children. I think this guy is going to start a war. Is he going to start a war? This is what she asked, because I was American. She thought somehow I knew better what was going to happen. She said, is he going to start a war? And I said, yeah, probably. And she thought, she was like afraid that he was going to attack England. And I said, I wouldn't, but you don't have to personally worry about it, because he's going to identify some poor defense, like his father, will identify some poor defenseless country that can't fight back. And that I was saying, like, sometime between November of 2000 and February or March of 2001. That's what I was saying in response to a very frightened, and as it turns out, accurately a frightened woman from England who said, is he going to start a war? She was scared that this Bush guy was going to start a war. She somehow had her gut reaction, or whatever psychic gut reaction. She felt it in her gut. She didn't know why, but somehow she looked at this guy and heard this bullshit he was spouting in the so-called election, and she said, I think he's going to start a war. And she was absolutely right, and my response to her was absolutely right. Yes, he will. He most likely will. But what he'll do is he'll identify some poor defenseless country that can't stand up for themselves, just like his father. And when that country turned out to be, well, when it first turned out to be Afghanistan, that definitely fit my description. A poor defenseless country that had been racked by decades of attacks from the Soviet Union, and who knows what else, possibly even India, I don't know, it was decades of warfare had devastated the whole Afghan society. And they were the first ones that we invaded. Obviously, yes, that absolutely fit my description of a poor defenseless country that can't in any way retaliate against us. And then when his next target became Iraq, that absolutely not only didn't surprise me, it completely confirmed every bit of my gut reaction that he was going to continue his father's unfinished business. So my point in making this is, regardless of the architects and engineers' smoking gun, my absolutely immediate reaction was that this was an inside job. Without knowing anything about Building 7, and controlled demolition, which is what the architects and engineers reports are all about. That smoking gun. The fact is, here's my point. When a murder is committed, of all the murders that are committed, it is a very, very small percentage in which the police actually come across a smoking gun, murder weapon, Exhibit A at the scene of the crime. That doesn't mean that we just give up and stop having suspicions and stop needing to investigate to try to all the clues to try to piece together who could have committed the murder and why. Well, first we begin with why. Usually we begin with why to lead us to the who. That's what the legal system does. Tries to find who is responsible so that they can punish the perpetrators. That's what our legal system does. Try to look for the perpetrators in order to punish them and to prevent them from being at liberty to continue to repeat the crime. So we begin with the why. We ask, what is the motivate? Who would have an incentive to commit this murder? We begin with what was the motivation? What might the incentive have been, to then lead us to consider the questions of who would have such an incentive. And there does not have to be a smoking gun. All there needs to be is a murder. And if there is a gun, what there usually is not a gun at all, just a bullet, which needs for ballistics experts to trace what the gun that it came from would be. It does not need to be a smoking gun or a gun at all for us to be extremely suspicious of murder and extremely dedicated to conducting a thorough investigation using such techniques as reasoning, the reasoning of questioning who was murdered and who would have had a motivation to commit the murder of that murder. So here is my problem. Mr. Gage, the founder of the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, wants to sidestep, at least publicly, in his public discussion, the questions of speculation on motivation and incentive, and who would have had such motives and such incentives to make them the likely suspects, because those questions are outside of the realm of the immediate realm of the questions of smoking gun evidence. But I didn't need smoking gun evidence in the first place to suspect that it was in fact an inside job. So I don't personally feel obligated to confine myself to questions of smoking gun factual scientific evidence when the crime itself raises the serious questions of actual motivations and incentives of who would have done this and why. Because after all, if we say nothing, what we are left with is an official story, an official posturing by the United States government, which very precisely does engage in these activities of identifying who the main suspect is. We believe, for they started off saying we believe that Osama bin Laden was the most likely suspect, and they quickly turned that up, ratcheted that up into we know he did it. We are certain that Osama bin Laden was the perpetrator of this. And no use of the only smoking gun they needed was the smoking buildings themselves, and to base on that the prejudices of the average American public, the anti-Islamic, anti-Arabic, anti-foreigner prejudices of the general American public was enough to base unfounded accusations, unproven accusations about who they pointed the finger at and identified as the prime suspect, with no actual circumstantial or any particular evidence to actually back up those claims. But that lack of evidence did not inhibit the United States government from immediately going into that accusation mode. So why should I feel inhibited from doing the same thing, of using my own rational deduction to try to ask the very basic criminal investigation questions of who had the incentive, who would have had the motivation and the incentive and the opportunity and the means. These are the four questions that are asked in criminal trials. Who had the incentive, the motivation, the opportunity, and the means? These are the questions that are asked in criminal investigations where there is no actual smoking gun, but nonetheless there is clear evidence of a crime having been committed, and we need to use rational deduction and investigation to try to sort out the facts of what happened and why, and who, most importantly, who is responsible for what happened. So when architects and engineers try to officially avoid those questions, because that seems to be the more effective approach from their point of view in trying to gain the attention of the average American public, who have so immediately swallowed the official story. I don't personally feel that I, as a non-expert in the field of architecture and engineering, I don't feel obligated to confine myself in that manner. I feel perfectly free and justified in continuing to pose the same questions that I posed on the very day that it happened. Who had the actual incentive and motivation for doing this, and who had the opportunity and the means to carry it out? And I have to compare what seemed to me the obvious answer of who had the opportunity and the means, as well as the motivation and incentive, seemed to me Bush and Cheney and their whole gang. Rumsfeld, Powell, the whole damn fucking goddamn Nazi bunch of them. Where it seemed to me the obvious prime suspects of who had the opportunity and the means and the motivations and incentive to carry out this conspired attack. But I compare that possibility against their official and immediate and unproven accusations that a bunch of fanatical Muslims had the opportunity, supposedly the opportunity by buying ordinary passenger seats on commercial airlines, and the means, somehow knowing exactly how to carry out this sort of attack, and having just a couple dozen fanatical followers willing to sacrifice their lives for this incomprehensible goal. And then that becomes the question. The goal itself, the incentive, the motivation. What was the goal of such an attack? What would be the motivation to arrange to go through the intense training and preparation that would have been necessary to carry out this orchestrated plot to fly these airplanes into these buildings? What would have been the motivation to arrange this whole complex training and preparation to carry out this attack, including people, a couple dozen people, willing to give their lives for the purpose of accomplishing this mission? What was the mission? What kind of sense was there in this mission? What possible incentive would there have been for anybody, however fanatical, to think, oh, we're going to accomplish something worth sacrificing our lives for by flying airplanes into these to try to destroy these two buildings? What kind of thinking process would somebody... What the hell? What the hell was the purpose of Muslims thinking, oh, we're going to crash these two World Trade Center buildings on the 11th day of September? To bring the Western Christian world to its knees. That's what the official story was, that their intention was to bring our society to its knees because they hate us, because we love freedom and they hate freedom. That was what the official story was boiled down to in a nutshell. They hate us because we're free. They hate freedom because they don't love Jesus. They love Allah, and Allah hates freedom, and they want to destroy our freedom by flying airplanes into the World Trade Centers. What a brilliant plan. It could not what a fiendishly brilliant plan that could not possibly fail. So one would think. That's what we were told. And I looked at that and I said, what the hell kind of sense does that make? What the hell kind of motivation would any human being capable of putting their pants on and buttoning their own shirt? What kind of motivation would anybody with enough reasoning ability to dress themselves and to feed themselves, let alone carry out a precision strategic plan to carry out this attack without being suspected, boarding an airplane without weapons and using plastic airline knives to threaten pilots for the purpose? What possible incentive would any rational